Wind carried the faint scent of pine and old wood as Maria Schwarzenegger stepped onto her porch, a steaming cup of coffee nestled between her weather hands. At 87, her spine no longer stood as straight as it once did, but her eyes, sharp blue and unsparing, had lost none of their clarity. The early Montana frost painted silver patterns across the rails of the porch, and beyond them, her land stretched in every direction like a living memory. This farm wasn't just soil and timber. It was where her late husband had built every fence post with his own hands, where she had raised her children, and where she now lived alone. Or at least, that's what they thought. The rumble of engines shattered the morning stillness. Not the kind of engine noise that belonged to neighbors in old trucks, but something heavier, more precise. Maria didn't flinch. She simply set the cup down gently and waited. 3 black SUVs rolled up her long gravel driveway, tires grinding like a warning. They parked too close to the porch, too confidently. Men emerged in dark suits, polished shoes already caked with dust. One of them, tall, lean, and dressed like a Wall Street predator, led the group. His name was Marcus Stone, and Maria recognized his type instantly. Greedy, entitled, dangerous. He didn't bother with small talk. "Mrs. Schwarzenegger," he said, voice soaked in fake warmth. "Beautiful morning. Perfect time to discuss your property." "I believe I was clear last week," Maria replied, her voice calm but cold. "This farm is not for sale." Marcus smiled, but his eyes didn't. "The offer has increased. Significantly. 10 times market value. Cash. At your age, managing land this size must be exhausting." Maria didn't blink. "My husband and I didn't build this to sell it. My family grew up here. My son learned to shoot by the old barn. This land remembers us. I don't care how much you offer." Marcus's facade cracked slightly. "Mrs. Schwarzenegger, I'm not sure you understand the opportunity. This region is changing. There's going to be development, progress. You don't want to be left behind." "I understand perfectly," she said, voice cooling further. "I understand that real businessmen don't bring armed escorts to a negotiation. And I understand that what you're calling progress smells a lot like coercion." His eyes hardened. He took a step onto the porch, slow and deliberate. "Pride like yours can be dangerous. Accidents happen on farms, especially to elderly women. Alone." Maria didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply smiled. "That's your first mistake," she said softly. "You assumed I was alone." She nodded toward the living room window, where the sun caught the gleaming scope of a rifle resting openly against a frame. Not hidden, not subtle, just visible enough. "I may be old," she continued, "but I am not helpless." The men behind Marcus tensed, their hands drifting instinctively toward their waistbands. Former military, she guessed, or something darker. Mercenaries. Marcus gave a dry laugh. "And your second claim?" "You assumed I wouldn't recognize what you really are," Maria said. "You think intimidation is power. But you've never had to bury a husband who fought men like you. My son knows better, too." There was a flicker in Marcus's expression. "Your son, right? The CIA ghost. The one who disappeared. You think he's coming to save you?" Maria slowly pulled a small phone from the pocket of her cardigan. "No," she said. "I don't think. I know." She pressed a single button. The line connected instantly. A pause. Then a voice, calm and deep, came through the speaker. "Mom." "Arnold," she said, her voice steady. "Remember what you told me? That if anyone ever came here trying to take what didn't belong to them, I should call you." There was silence on the line for a beat. When Arnold spoke again, his voice had changed. It carried something old, something hard. "What happened?" "They're here," Maria said, never taking her eyes off Marcus. "And they won't take no for an answer." The line clicked. No goodbye, no promises, just the sudden silence of a man already in motion. Maria slipped the phone back into her pocket. "That's the second mistake, Mr. Stone. You came here thinking I was weak, but you've never met my son." Marcus stood still for a moment, calculating. Then, like a predator testing the fence, he stepped back. "We'll be in touch," he said. Maria didn't answer. She watched them go. watched the SUVs shrink into the horizon. Only when the dust settled did she let her fingers tremble, just slightly. Behind her, on the wall, a photograph hung, Arnold in uniform, standing beside a flag. The frame was old, but the image sharp, a reminder, perhaps, of what still lived beneath the surface. A quiet storm waiting to return. And far away, in a fortified house surrounded by pine and memory, Arnold Schwarzenegger opened a drawer and looked at the badge he hadn't worn in years. His reflection in the glass said nothing, but the storm had already begun. The military base sat tucked between jagged ridgelines, the kind of place most maps forgot and most people never knew existed. Inside, everything moved with silent precision. Shadows passed under fluorescent lights, boots echoed down steel corridors, and men trained like their lives depended on it, because they did. At the far end of a secure wing, a room filled with outdated photographs and classified documents sat undisturbed. That was until Arnold Schwarzenegger pushed the door open without a word. He didn't bother with protocol. He rarely did. His presence alone was enough to pause conversations and draw quiet glances. In this place, everyone knew who he was, not just by name, but by reputation. They knew the stories, the missions without details, the rescues that were never logged, the enemies that were never officially killed. He was a man they called when things fell apart. And for a long time, he hadn't answered that call. Until now, he stood at his locker, hands slow and steady as they moved through equipment that hadn't seen daylight in years. A black duffel bag lay open at his feet, swallowing the weight of weapons, comms gear, and the kind of tools he didn't talk about. He didn't rush. He moved with the calm of someone who'd done this more times than he could count. Each item had a purpose. Each action was quiet, precise, final. Behind him, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Didn't think I'd see you gear up again." Arnold turned slightly. David Meyer stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He'd been with Arnold in the early days, when missions were handed out in whispers and success meant no headlines. "It's not a mission," Arnold said, zipping the bag closed. "It's personal." David gave a low whistle. "That farm again? What's going on?" Arnold's eyes narrowed, his voice a low rumble. "They threatened my mother." David didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "You driving or flying?" "Driving," Arnold said. "I need time to think." David nodded once, then grabbed a second bag from the wall. "I'll go with you." They left without ceremony. No send-off, no orders, no approval required. The kind of respect Arnold commanded wasn't written into protocol. It was earned mission after mission. And now, without fanfare, two ghosts slipped out of the base and into the world they'd once protected from the shadows. The road stretched endlessly before them, cutting through valleys and mountains like a scar through history. They drove in shifts, switching every few hours without speaking much. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a silence of understanding. They both knew what it meant when a man like Arnold said, "They threatened my mother." Somewhere around the 12th hour, David finally broke the quiet. "You think it's local?" "No," Arnold said. "Too clean. Too fast." These people knew how to approach a widow, what to say, how to hide muscle behind suits. They weren't amateurs. Organized. Arnold nodded. Cartel level, maybe worse. David leaned back in his seat, processing that. And they picked the wrong farm. "They picked the wrong mother," Arnold corrected. The sun dipped low as they passed a welcome to Whispering Pine sign, paint peeling from years of wind and indifference. The town looked the same, but Arnold saw the differences instantly. New security cameras on lampposts. Shiny black trucks parked near shuttered stores. People walking faster, heads down, conversations ending when strangers passed. "They've got a grip on this place," David murmured. "Not for long," Arnold said. They turned off the main road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as they pulled up to the sheriff's department. Same brick building, same wooden bench outside. But the tension in the air was unmistakable. The kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. Sheriff Linda Hart stepped out as they approached. Her face was older than Arnold remembered, but the fire in her eyes was the same. "About time," she said. "How bad?" Arnold asked. "Worse than she told you," Linda replied, glancing around as if even the shadows might be listening. They'd been leaning on half the town. Intimidation, property buys, bribes, even some fires. No proof, of course. And the county? Bought and paid for. Commissioners in their pocket. Judges, too. They've been calling this economic development. Arnold's jaw tightened. And my mother? She's the last one standing in their way. Not anymore, Arnold said quietly. She's not standing alone. They left the station and drove the final stretch to the farm. The sun had vanished behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. As they turned onto a familiar gravel path, the porch light flicked on. Maria was waiting, standing straight as ever, arms folded. She didn't say a word as Arnold stepped out of the truck and met her at the top of the steps. "You came," she said. "I told you I would," he replied. She looked him over, as if measuring whether he was still the man she remembered. Then she turned to David. "Still dragging this one around?" David grinned. "Some things never change." Maria nodded once, then stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the house smelled with smoke and old books. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Outside, in the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light, unseen eyes watched the reunion. From the compound on the edge of town, Marcus Stone received the news. The old woman's son had arrived. He crushed a cigarette into the desk. "So," he said, "that's how she wanted to play it." But he didn't realize what she had really done. She hadn't called for protection. She had called for war. The morning after Arnold arrived, the air over Whispering Pines felt different. It wasn't louder, but it was heavier, like the wind had stopped moving just long enough to listen. Arnold stood on the front porch of his mother's farmhouse, hands resting on the worn wooden railing. His eyes scanned the fields, the tree line, the hills beyond. He wasn't admiring the view. He was memorizing the terrain. David emerged from the barn, carrying a laptop and a metal case. He'd spent the night setting up a temporary operations post in the old tool shed, retrofitting it with signal jammers, encrypted comms, and drone surveillance access. Arnold watched him approach, but said nothing. "I've got satellite scans from the last 48 hours, David said, placing the laptop on the porch table. "Check this out." The screen lit up with heat maps and thermal overlays. David pointed to a cluster of buildings just outside town limits. "That's the Stone property, on paper, a development company HQ. But it's not just business. Too many power fluctuations at night. Too many short-range encrypted bursts. They've got a base of operations out there." Arnold's expression didn't change. "Cartel? Feels like it. But it's cleaner than that. They're buying property up and down the county line. Locals sell under pressure. Some disappear. Some suddenly have money they didn't used to." Arnold leaned closer. "And Whispering Pines is the last gap in their map. Your mother's farm is the final piece. High ground, bordering federal land. Overlooks 3 highways. If they get this land, they control the whole corridor." Arnold nodded once. "Then we don't let them." David brought up a second file. "You remember Maria Santos? Reporter from the Chronicle? Sharp, persistent. She's been tracking property fraud cases across the state. I gave her a heads up. She's on her way." Just as he said it, the sound of tires on gravel announced her arrival. A dusty SUV pulled up, and Maria stepped out, carrying a thick folder and a camera slung across her shoulder. She looked older than the last time Arnold saw her, but no less focused. "I figure if you were in town, something big was happening," she said without preamble. Arnold gestured toward the porch. "What do you have?" Maria opened the folder. Deeds, photos, shell company registrations, maps connecting property acquisitions from Whispering Pines to the Canadian border. "They're building a distribution network," she explained. "But not just drugs. Weapons, people, money laundering. It's all here, disguised as redevelopment." David added, "And they're protected. Political contacts, law enforcement ties. This isn't just Marcus Stone's operation." Maria flipped to a photo of a man in a tailored suit, shaking hands with a state commissioner. This guy shows up too often. He's not local. No digital footprint. Calls himself Phillips. Works for something called the Foundation. Arnold's eyes narrowed. He'd heard of them before, just whispers in black files buried in locked drawers. The Foundation wasn't a cartel. It wasn't a gang. It was worse. It was infrastructure, a ghost network that supported criminal empires from inside. When someone like Phillips showed up, it meant a town wasn't just being threatened, it was being replaced. Stone's just a face, Arnold said. A front. They're hiding something much bigger behind him. Maria nodded. And your mother's land is a keystone. Once they have it, everything connects. David shut the laptop. So we pull the thread before they finish the weave. Arnold stood. We start now. They split up. Maria returned to town to dig deeper, knowing she'd be watched. David launched a drone and began scanning the outer perimeter of the stone compound. Arnold took a quieter route. On foot, across back trails he knew from childhood, where no security cam would expect him to appear. He wanted eyes on the threat. Real eyes. As he moved through pine in silence, he saw the signs. New tire tracks where none should be. Tree markings used for drone positioning. Small changes invisible to the average eye, but not to him. He reached a ridge and pulled out binoculars. The stone compound came into view. It was sprawling, too large, too modern, too protected. Men walked the perimeter in staggered patrols. Some carried rifles. Others carried nothing but moved like professionals. Inside one of the buildings, a black SUV idled with the engine running. A brief flash of a face. Phillips. Calm, suited, dangerous. He was talking to Stone, whose posture betrayed frustration. Something was going wrong. Maybe Arnold's return had been unexpected. Maybe Maria's presence was becoming a liability. Arnold took a single photo through the lens, then disappeared back into the trees. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, Maria had more news. 2 local deputies, Thompson and Graves, redirecting patrols away from known smuggling routes. Sheriff Hart's been isolated. Most of her clean staff reassigned. They're closing the loop, David said, trying to finish the takeover without raising alarms. Then we give them the alarm, Arnold replied. That night, lights in the farmhouse stayed low. Cameras were installed around the perimeter. Motion sensors disguised as broken yard tools were placed near the fence line. The land might have looked quiet, but it was watching now. From the porch, Maria looked out into the dark. You think they know what you're building here? Arnold didn't answer right away. He stared into the fields, where his mother once grew corn with her bare hands, where his father had died splitting fence posts, where men now thought they could rewrite a town's future with threats and paper. They think we're just a few people on a forgotten farm, he said quietly. Let them. Because in the silence of whispering pines, something had already shifted, and the enemy hadn't noticed yet. The next morning, the town of Whispering Pines looked the same on the surface. Quiet streets, shuttered storefronts, a windmill creaking behind the old feed store. But beneath the surface, something had started to shift. Arnold could feel it, not in the news or in any report, but in the way people looked at him now. Not with fear, not with awe, but with something deeper, recognition. He walked down Main Street, boots silent on the cracked pavement, eyes scanning everything. Most of the town pretended not to notice him. But not all. Some nodded. Some lingered a second too long. At Bill Anderson's diner, the window blinds twitched, and when Arnold stepped inside, the low murmur of conversation quieted. Bill himself came out from behind the counter. His hands were older, thicker now, but his eyes hadn't dulled. He poured a cup of black coffee without asking and slid it across the counter. Haven't seen you since your father's funeral, Bill said. Didn't plan on coming back, Arnold replied. Well, Bill said, seems like they gave you a reason. Arnold nodded once. Bill leaned in, voice lower. Things started changing a year ago. Men in suits, cash offers, new trucks with out-of-state plates. People sold, or gave up, or disappeared. But some stayed. I know, Arnold said. That's why I'm here. He stood, left a 20 on the counter, and walked out. Across the street, Jenny Thompson was unlocking her store. She paused when she saw him, fingers tight on her keys. Then, without a word, she nodded once and went inside. Later that afternoon, back at the farm, Maria arrived with more news. "They're watching everything," she said. "Phone lines tapped. Cameras in town square. Stone has men pretending to be utility workers surveying houses. And 2 more deputies just got replaced. They're tightening control," David said. "No," Arnold replied. "They're afraid." The 3 of them stood around a dining room table, the same table Arnold's mother had used for Sunday dinners and silent grief. Now it held blueprints, photos, hand-drawn maps. A war table in a house built by farmers. "We need eyes in town," Arnold said. "People who still care. People who haven't sold out." "I can name a few," Maria said. "Mike at the garage. Jenny Thompson. Sheriff Hart, if she's not already fired. And Bill, of course. Then we bring them in," Arnold said, quietly. That night, Mike Foster came to farm under the cover of darkness. He was a big man with grease-stained hands and quiet eyes. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded when Arnold explained the situation. "I'll help," Mike said, "but I won't put my daughter at risk." "We won't ask you to," Arnold said. "But we're not going to win this if we act alone." The next day, Jenny arrived with fresh bread and a shopping bag filled with nothing important. On the surface, it was just a neighborly visit. But inside the bag was a flash drive containing surveillance footage from her store's hidden back camera, Stone's men photographing her deliveries. By midweek, the farm had become something more than a home. It was a hub. People came and went at odd hours. Some brought food, others brought tools. But everyone left behind something more valuable: information. Bill started leaving coded messages in the pot orders. Sheriff Hart began quietly rerouting patrols to avoid roads where Stone's men were setting up cameras. And Mike? He installed a high-range signal interceptor beneath a rusted tractor. David monitored it all, from the barn's converted loft. He tracked cell signals, intercepted coded radio bursts, and mapped where Stone's teams were concentrating. "They're preparing for something," he said. "Moving resources. Reinforcing the compound. They know we're watching." "Good," Arnold said. "Then they'll make mistakes." One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ridge, Arnold stood in the barn doorway, watching as Jenny helped Maria replace the front porch light. It wasn't about the bulb. It was about routine, about showing the neighbors that life still continued. Maria leaned close. "People are starting to notice. They're watching your mother's farm again." "Let them," Arnold said. Jenny glanced over. "You really think we can win this?" Arnold met her eyes. "Not if we wait for someone else to save us." In the darkness beyond the fields, the Stone compound glowed like a scar. Inside, Marcus Stone threw a folder onto the table. Photos of Arnold, Maria, David, notes on their movements. A map of the farm with red X's. Philip stood beside him, calm as ever. "You said this would be simple," Stone growled. "I said it would be effective," Phillips replied, "if you follow the plan." "Well, your plan didn't mention a trained ghost showing up with half the town behind him." Phillips looked out the window, unbothered. "Then perhaps it's time we stop treating this like business." Stone stared at him. "You're saying go loud?" "I'm saying," Phillips replied, "it's time to remind them who owns this town." But what neither of them saw, what they couldn't understand, was that the town they thought they owned was waking up, not with riots, not with banners, but with quiet resistance. A glance held too long, a door left unlocked, a whisper passed from diner to garage to store. And in the center of it all, the Schwarzenegger farm stood still, watching, listening, waiting. Night settled over whispering pines like a blanket soaked in tension. The air was still, but not calm. It was the kind of stillness that came before something broke. At the Schwarzenegger farm, every light had been turned off hours ago, save for one lamp in the kitchen, casting a soft glow on Maria's face as she stirred tea with a steady hand. Outside, nothing moved. Not visibly, at least. In the barn, David's eyes flicked between monitors. Drones were circling high above the ridge. Motion sensors lined the perimeter. Communications jammers sat embedded in the husks of old tractors. Everything was silent, too silent. Arnold stood in the shadows by the front door, arms crossed, expression like granite. He hadn't said much in the last hour. He didn't need to. He had already spent the day walking the land with purpose, every step a preparation. He knew exactly where they would come from. He had spent his life studying men who thought violence was a language of control. And tonight, they would speak it. "They're moving," David said quietly. 6 vehicles. Lights off, coming in from the south tree line, fanning out. "How long?" Arnold asked. 3 minutes, max. Arnold nodded and turned to his mother. "Go to the cellar. Like we practice." Maria didn't argue. She stood, kissed his cheek once, and walked calmly through the kitchen door. Her presence didn't waver, but something in the air shifted with her exit, like the weight of memory had moved to let something else rise. David activated the floodlights, but they remained dormant for now. He synced the jammers. Comms interference ready. They won't be able to coordinate once they're inside range. Arnold stepped outside, boots silent on the porch wood. His eyes adjusted to the dark, but he didn't need to see clearly. He could feel it, the movement in the trees, the rhythm of men trained to disappear into blackness. But they weren't disappearing tonight. They were walking into something designed to look vulnerable. They were walking into the hands of a man who didn't bluff. At the far edge of the pasture, Mike Foster's pickup sat hidden behind hay bales. Next to it, Jenny crouched behind the wheel of her mother's old station wagon, engine off, eyes locked on the road. Targets entering grid zone. David's voice came through a low earpiece. 2 heading for the west gate, from moving toward the barn. Arnold didn't move. He waited. Then it began. The first 2 men reached the west gate and touched the latch, exactly as planned. Suddenly, every light on the farm ignited. Floodlights mounted on the barn, the silo, even the chicken coop roared to life, turning night into day. The men froze, exposed, weapons raised. But too late. "They're lit," David said. "Sniper positions compromised." Arnold stepped forward. His voice cut through the cold air like steel. "You have 10 seconds to leave this property." From the shadows, Marcus Stone's voice barked over a radio channel. "Clear those vehicles. Now!" The attackers surged forward. 2 advanced toward the porch. Another team moved to the barn, unaware that the doors had been rigged to trigger decoy flashbangs. The instant they pushed through, a blinding cascade of light and sound erupted, sending them stumbling backward. At the same moment, Maria's voice came softly through a hidden channel. "They're inside the south fence line." Arnold replied without turning. "Confirmed." Phase 2. From the town road, a convoy of headlights appeared. Trucks, tractors, farm vehicles driven by local residents who had waited long enough to stop being afraid. They blocked the access road, forming a wall of engines and steel. Unarmed but unflinching, Marcus watched from the tree line, furious. "Take them out," he ordered. But his mercenaries hesitated. The situation had changed. What was supposed to be a quiet pressure job had turned into a full-blown confrontation. Cameras flashed from hidden positions. Maria Santos had arrived, lens trained on the chaos, documenting everything. Stone growled, "Snipers, find your targets." But they couldn't. The scopes had been tampered with, painted over by local hunters during the day. The hills that once belonged to them now belonged to someone else. Then another voice cut through the static. It wasn't Arnold's. It was Sheriff Hart. "This is law enforcement. Armed individuals have been identified threatening civilians. Units are en route. Cease all movement immediately." Stone realized too late that they'd been baited. Every step, every position, every tactic had been anticipated. "Fall back," he snapped. "Pull everyone out." The mercenaries retreated, discipline broken, formation scattered. But not all of them. 2 figures broke from the main group, sprinting toward the barn with bottles in hand. Molotov cocktails. Fire. Desperation. One of them lit the wick, drew back his arm. He never released. A blur moved from the dark. David struck first, one clean motion, disarming the man and sending him to the dirt. The second turned, but Arnold was already behind him. A single strike sent the bottle tumbling, unlit, onto the grass. In seconds, both attackers were zip-tied and silenced. The authorities arrived moments later. Flashing lights, sirens muted by urgency. Officers flooded the property, collecting weapons, questioning mercenaries, sealing off the road. Inside the house, Maria returned to the kitchen, calm once again. She looked at her son, who stood near the window, watching the chaos settle. "You okay?" she asked. Arnold nodded. They blinked. She poured another cup of tea. That was never a fair fight. Arnold looked at her. "No," he said, "it wasn't." And outside, as federal agents opened trunks and unmarked cases, the truth finally began to emerge. Military-grade weapons, maps, routes, communications equipment, and buried in the back of one vehicle, documents stamped with symbols that didn't belong to any known agency. David stepped into the kitchen, holding one of the folders. "This isn't just stone," he said. "This goes higher." Arnold looked out at the field, his father's field. Quiet now, smoldering with truth. "Good," he said. "Then it falls harder." The aftermath of the failed assault didn't bring peace. It brought silence, not the peaceful kind, but the dangerous kind that settles in before something worse. By morning, Whispering Pines looked like it always had. Quaint storefronts, the postman on his usual route, the coffee brewing at Bill Anderson's diner. But everyone who'd been at the farm a night before knew the truth. The storm hadn't passed. It had only changed direction. Inside the diner, Arnold sat near the window, his back to the wall, watching the street through the reflection in the glass. David sat across from him, flipping through photos printed just hours earlier. Surveillance shots, men in suits walking the town perimeter, black sedans parked at strategic corners, faces unfamiliar, but posture unmistakable, contractors. Not local, not cartel. These were the kind of men who didn't carry badges, didn't make arrests. They erased problems. They brought in professionals, David said, sliding one of the photos across the table. Arnold studied it. The man wore a tailor coat, but the way he held his stance said military. Calm, calculated. The kind of calm that meant he'd done this before, too many times. "Who do they work for?" Arnold asked. David lowered his voice. "Private military. Could be Blackthorn, Orvos, something offshore. All shell names. The kind of teams you hire when you want results without questions." Arnold didn't respond. Instead, he looked out the street again, where a black SUV slowly rolled past. The driver never looked in, but they didn't need to. Their message had already been delivered. "We see you. We know where you sit. And if you don't stop, we won't either." Maria entered the diner through the side door. She moved quickly, dropping a file on the table and sliding into the booth beside David. "You need to see this. The foundation isn't just protecting stone. They're investing, laundering cartel money through real estate, hiding weapons shipments in agricultural routes, even selling access to government data streams." David flipped open the file. "This is hard evidence. It's a start, and it gets worse." Maria leaned closer. "Two cartel representatives checked into the Mountain View Hotel this morning. They came in quiet, with diplomatic passports. I only found them because the clerk used to be my source." Arnold's jaw tightened. "They're bringing in the next tier." Stone lost control, Maria said. "Now they're cleaning up." That afternoon, federal agents arrived in Whispering Pines, but not the ones Arnold had worked with before. These wore crisp suits, asked rehearsed questions, and requested copies of everything collected from the night's incident. At the sheriff's office, Linda Hart stood firm. When asked to surrender evidence, she simply said, "Already forwarded to the FBI's Helena Field office. You can talk to them." She watched their faces carefully. The agents didn't push. They smiled, nodded, and walked out. But she knew they weren't here for a report. They were here to assess the threat. Not the one coming from Stone. The one coming from Arnold and the people standing beside him. Back at the farm, Arnold rechecked the perimeter. Reinforced cameras. Traps reset. Communication relays hidden in old irrigation pipes. He walked slowly, pausing at the old oak near the south fence. It had stood for generations, just like his family, just like the land. But now it wasn't just his family's legacy at risk. It was the whole town. Inside, Maria paced the living room, scrolling through encrypted files on her laptop. "They're trying to bury the story," she said. "My editor just got a call from someone offering to buy the paper outright. Full buyout. No conditions. Just walk away." "And if he says no?" David asked. "They'll find someone else to make the decision for him." By sundown, the pressure campaign had begun. Health inspectors appeared at Mike Foster's garage with a surprise audit. Jenny Thompson's store was slapped with a condemnation notice for supposed structural hazards. The diner received a notice of fire code violations that hadn't existed in 50 years. But the town didn't bend. Not this time. Customers arrived at Jenny's store and helped her reopen the back door. Mike's clients parked their trucks in front of the inspection crew, blocking access. And at the diner, regulars donated fans, extinguishers, and wiring, more than enough to satisfy any code, real or imagined. Stone sat in the compound's main office, surrounded by silence. His own men had started to disappear. One fled to Canada. Another turned up in a ditch outside Billings. The cartel's representatives watched him now, not as partners, but as auditors. He had failed. And worse, he had brought attention. Phillips returned at midnight. He didn't knock. He simply walked in. "You had one job," he said calmly. "I gave you the land," Stone barked. "I gave you the roads. You lost it when he came back." Phillips didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a photo. Arnold, standing beside the sheriff, speaking to reporters. "This man," Phillips said, "has ruined more operations than you could imagine, and now he's made us visible." Stone's voice dropped. "Then take him out." Phillips smiled slightly. "That's already underway." The next morning, Maria's car exploded. She wasn't in it. David had insisted she take a different vehicle. But the message was clear. No more pressure. No more negotiation. From this point forward, it was elimination. Arnold watched from the porch as federal agents dusted the wreckage. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He only turned to David and said, "They're coming." David nodded. "We're ready." But Arnold knew better. No one was ever ready for what the Foundation unleashed when cornered. And this time, they weren't just fighting for control. They were fighting to stay invisible. The rain came in the early morning hours, a soft patter on the farmhouse roof that did little to wash away the weight pressing down on whispering pines. The town had crossed a line, and so had the men hunting it. No more quiet threats. No more hidden pressure. The Foundation had stepped fully into the light, and even in the rain, Arnold could feel the heat of something coming. He stood in the barn, tightening the last strap on his vest, every movement calm, deliberate. Across from him, David checked the final comms frequencies, running diagnostics on their encrypted loop. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. The time for planning had passed. What remained now was action. At the edge of the property, trucks lined up beneath tarps, engines cold, tires muddy. Farmers, veterans, mechanics, locals who had stopped being afraid. No one wore uniforms, but every one of them had shown up when the call went out. Not for a paycheck, not for politics, for each other. Inside the house, Maria sat at the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea. She wore the same sweater she'd had on the night the threats began. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. She watched the window, listened for the sounds of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with weather. "They're moving." David's voice came through the radio. "How many?" Arnold asked. "Convoy. 8 SUVs, 1 unmarked transport. Looks like 2 drones in support. Estimated ETA for minutes." Arnold stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain hit his shoulders. He glanced at the tree line where Jenny and Mike waited in position. Bill Anderson was at the diner, ready to trigger the emergency relay if things went wrong. Sheriff Hart was positioned just off the access road, feeding live location data to the state troopers she could still trust. Maria Santos had already transmitted all the evidence to 4 national outlets. Even if they lost tonight, the story wouldn't die. The first headlights appeared through the fog like the eyes of something too big to kill. The convoy rolled slow and wide, engines growling, windows tinted dark. They didn't stop at the gate. They didn't ask questions. They pulled directly into the open clearing in front of the house, tires slicing mud like knives. Arnold stood alone. The lead vehicle opened, and a man stepped out. Phillips, dry despite the rain, dressed like a man who still believed he was untouchable. Behind him, 6 armed men fanned out, each one moving like clockwork. Trained, efficient. "You should have taken the offer," Phillips said, his voice casual, almost friendly. "You should have stayed hidden," Arnold replied. Phillips smiled. "You don't get to win just because you came home. That's not how this works." "No," Arnold said, "but sometimes coming home is the point." Phillips motioned, and 2 men stepped forward. One held a rifle, the other a small device, signal interceptor. They weren't just here to threaten anymore. They were here to erase. But then a low hum started. One of the men turned. Lights flickered along the fence line. A quiet crackle rose from the grass. "What is that?" one of the mercenaries asked. Arnold didn't answer. From the barn, David flipped the master switch. Across the field, devices hidden in old farm equipment activated, broadcasting, jamming, streaming. Every movement, every command, every weapon raised was now being captured in real time and uploaded across multiple satellite paths. Within 30 seconds, the feed reached 5 networks, a dozen social media accounts, and an encrypted drop to international law offices. Phillips turned slowly, the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think this matters?" he said. "They'll bury it." "No," Arnold replied. "They'll bury you." Suddenly, tires screamed on the access road. Black and white cruisers emerged from the trees, followed by 3 federal vehicles with real markings and real agents. The Foundation's mercenaries lifted their weapons but stopped when they saw the badge flashes and the number of cameras pointed in their direction. Sheriff Hart stepped out, flanked by state investigators and a U.S. Marshal. "This property is under lawful protection," she said loudly. "Any attempt to interfere will be considered an act of domestic terrorism." Phillips didn't flinch, but his team did. One of the mercenaries dropped his weapon. Another backed away. The others hesitated. Arnold stepped forward, voice steady. "It's over." Phillips met his eyes. "You don't know what you've done." Arnold didn't blink. "Yes, I do. I finished it." Within minutes, the Foundation convoy was surrounded, weapons confiscated, identity scanned. Several of the men tried to present credentials that didn't match any known agency. Phillips was taken last. His expression never cracked. Not once. But as he was led away, he looked back at Arnold. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something like recognition. It was a look of a man who understood that the rules had changed. That night, the rain washed the last of the tracks from the farm road. Maria finally exhaled. David packed up the surveillance gear. Sheriff Hart returned to the station and found 3 new officers waiting to join her. Maria Santos received confirmation that her story had run in every major outlet within the hour. And Arnold? He stood beneath the old oak tree, looking out over the land his father had worked, the house his mother still guarded, the town that had remembered how to fight. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked back inside.